Well, hello everybody. Matt Williamson here of Pop Goes the 60s. Today I am up north here in the big woods of Wisconsin. I come up here about once a year and just to get away from the city life and get a place here on the Peshtigo River. And I typically try to bang out a video when I'm up here because it's just so serene and tranquil. And today I've got another fun video for you. In the past, when I've been up here, I've done my favorite 60s movies. Well, today I'm going to talk about my favorite 60s TV shows. And we're going to go through a bunch here. And one of the things about television shows, I grew up in the 70s, so there was a great deal of programming that had to be filled, and there was a lot of 50s and 60s television that was used to fill that time. And these were the days when you didn't have round-the-clock programming. It just went from roughly maybe 6 in the morning till like midnight or 1 in the morning. You might have a late show or something on the weekends, but in those days, you didn't have as much TV around the clock. So I'm gonna start with my top 10 favorites, and then we'll go through a bunch of others that I know of that you're gonna know very well. I'm drinking Spaten Oktoberfest. It's that time of year, folks, and I thought I'd bring out a nice beer up here. My sons actually picked this one out, and yeah, tastes good this time of year. I don't always bring out the good beer. You see me drinking the Pabst, the Schlitz, the Blatz. Those are my summer quenching thirst beers. So today I've got the Spaten. All right, so I'm going to give you my top 10, and in no particular order. So one of the ones I started watching as a kid that I loved was Leave It to Beaver. Now that started in 1957, went to 1963, but that was a show that any kid could get into and watch and love. And that's a show that when I've watched it as an adult, it's just so well written and the timing's great. It's just one of those timeless shows that I really love. Some great characters in there as well. Okay, another one I watched, this is when I watched as a kid, and it was Mission Impossible. And I always remember that match starting at the beginning. Now, Mission Impossible went into the early 70s, and that's probably what I'm remembering it from. But that was a show that it just reeked 1960s, that whole James Bond thing. And I always liked that type of mystery, suspense, thriller. Okay, moving along to kind of a war sitcom here, and that's Hogan's Heroes. Now, one of the things about growing up in the 70s, they shoved a lot of these 60s sitcoms in daytime television. So a lot of these shows you could just watch during the day, and they were on every day. And Hogan's Heroes was just one of those. I love the song, the intro. I love the characters, and you know, the Germans kind of took it on the chin in that show, and Colonel Klink was just hilarious. And that's a show I can still watch as an adult and find very funny. Okay, Batman. How can a kid not like Batman? Now, Batman, I didn't start watching Batman until the mid-70s, and that started to come on about 1976 after school. And it was kind of a phenomenon amongst us kids, even at that time, because we we knew who Batman was. We'd seen cartoons and things, but had never seen the show. Probably heard of it, but that was one of those shows that just was, at the time I didn't think it was that campy. I knew it was, you know, fantasy, but you know, when you're a kid, you can suspend your belief. You're just purely entertained. Okay, let's go to the Monkees. Now, I did not watch the Monkees in the early 70s in reruns, which is when they started playing a lot. I didn't get to them till a little bit later, but that was a show I always loved because there was a lot of music in it. And the Monkees, when the revival hit in 1986 for the 20th anniversary, and MTV started playing the TV show nonstop, that's when I really got into it a lot more, and you know, I had a lot of their music already, started buying all their music. So the Monkees kind of continued that 60s campy style of television production, which I guess just was all the rage. Okay, another favorite, Beverly Hillbillies. Now the Beverly Hillbillies, today I watch, I can't believe how funny it is to me today. And it's just so over the top dumb, and how they did it with straight faces, I'll never know. But that show went on for about, 10 years, and it was one of the top shows. And I can see why. It just was so goofy. But I think that's the type of programming that a lot of 60s, that's just the style of the 60s. It was that over-the-top, fantasy, fantastic type of humor that I don't know that we see that much today, do we? Okay, let's go to That Girl. Marlo Thomas was probably the first crush I ever had, a television personality crush. For some reason, I love Marlo Thomas. I still remember the show opened with the kite flying, and for some reason that show was just on. I think my mother watched that show, and that's probably how I came to know that show. Okay, The Twilight Zone. Now, The Twilight Zone was one of those shows that I watched. It was on reruns on Saturdays, like post after cartoons. And that's how I started to watch The Twilight Zone. And I always liked it. I preferred it to The Outer Limits, which we'll talk about a little later. But it just was one of those mystery things that just made you think. Next one up, another mystery, Alfred Hitchcock Presents in the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. Now, I didn't really start watching this until I was more in college, because I don't remember it ever being on television until the cable television era. And I remember there was a contest, I think it was on AMC, American Movie Classics, where I think they were playing the series. I don't know if it was the whole series or not. They were playing it every night from like 8 p.m. to like 8 in the morning. And over the course of a week, you had to guess the exact amount of people that died in all those episodes. And I ended up like dropping out of college for a week just to do that. And I couldn't do it. It just got to be too much for me, and I gave up on it. So I don't know whoever won that or what they were giving away. But I got to know that series very well, and was a big Hitchcock fan. So I was more of a fan of the films, but a lot of the TV episodes are also very good. Finally, in my top 10, I'm going to end with what I think is maybe my favorite. I've got some smoke coming here. And that is The Andy Griffith Show. That's a show that we watched around dinner time. It was like fringe time. It was on at 5 o'clock for quite a while. So my family, I was still rather young. This was in the 70s. And that's something we watched together. And my parents had already seen the show. They knew The Andy Griffith Show well. So for us kids, we were seeing it for the first time, but we could watch it as a family. And that was, Don Knotts, Floyd the Barber, Gomer and Goober, the fun girls. It just was a very enjoyable experience. And there wasn't a lot of TV shows after that that really matched the quality or that type of humor. So those are my top 10. Okay, I've got a long list here. We're going to go through some others that I watched, and you're going to know most of these better than I do because most of my viewers are older than me. So let's talk about the sitcom of the 60s. I had mentioned how over the top they were and how ridiculous they were. And one of the ones that was probably most popular amongst my friends was Gilligan's Island. Now, you had to be a kid, I think, to really like it. And I'm not sure, it could have been aimed at too old of an audience when it was on in the 60s. Probably that, 9 to 14-year-old range, I don't know. But we loved it. Didn't realize how goofy it was. I remember trying to watch it in college. I couldn't believe how bad it was and how much I had loved it just a few short years earlier. Okay, we've got I Dream of Jeannie, Barbara Eden. This one was another one that I just was on a lot, and I watched it. And some of these shows you just watched because it was on. You had 3 network channels, ABC, NBC, CBS. We had a PBS, Public Broadcasting System channel, and we had a UHF channel. So the UHF channel had a lot of this stuff during the daytime, and which is how I come to know a lot of these shows. So I Dream of Jeannie was one of them, Bewitched was another. So both of those shows, including the before mentioned Hogan's Heroes, those went as late as 1971, as did the Beverly Hillbillies, I think. That Girl as well. So these 60s shows were popular enough that they spilled into the 70s. Much like a lot of 60s bands, they kind of petered out in the early 70s. Okay, Get Smart, Don Adams. Well, that was one of those things. Those catchphrases were around when I was a kid and didn't realize where they came from until I started watching the show. And then they had The Nude Bomb, which came out, I think, 1980, 81. So that was kind of popular amongst the kids. And we watched that on TV as a family as well. Now, Gomer Pyle was one that I never liked it as much as Andy Griffith. And I never was much into the whole Army aesthetic. But boy, Jim Nabors and the sergeant, I forget his name, Pyle. It was very funny. And just, there's so many characters that were so dumb in these 60 shows like Gomer Pyle or Gilligan and all these others. that it just really stretched the imagination. Okay, the next two shows, The Munsters and The Addams Family. Well, I was a Munsters guy. I did not like The Addams Family. I thought I had my line in the sand, and for some reason The Addams Family went too far. But for some reason The Munsters was okay. I liked The Munsters. The Munsters seemed to be a little bit darker in some ways, in just the house maybe, or characters. They didn't seem as cartoony, even though they were. Okay, we got the Dick Van Dyke Show. So that was one my folks always liked too. And having grown up watching Mary Tyler Moore, I knew who she was and knew this was the show she did before the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And Dick Van Dyke was always funny. You had Maury Amsterdam and Rose Marie and some really good characters in that one. Okay, Family Affair. This was a show I think made for kids. I mean, we had little kids in it, which is probably why we watched it so much. And I don't remember that much about it other than I remember Mr. French. I remember how his trimly trimmed beard, shapely beard, and that British accent. I always thought that character was good. All right, we are moving on to The Flying Nun. Here's another ridiculous one. And I didn't watch that one much, but I remember it being on, and you couldn't help but watch some of these shows that were on maybe just before the show you were really waiting to watch. Next one on the list here, Green Acres. Well, I was a Beverly Hillbillies fan over Green Acres. Similar types, well, kind of opposite, one coming to the city, the other going to the country. Great characters, of course, in Green Acres, and I just didn't really see that one in reruns as much. Not as much as My Three Sons. So My Three Sons was one that was on pretty early, and that for some reason, Fred MacMurray was just familiar to me. He was familiar to everybody because he was acting for decades. So Fred MacMurray as the father seemed to make perfect sense, and that was a fun show to watch. Pretty saccharine. So that's another batch of shows that I watched. Here are a few sitcoms that I didn't watch that are pretty famous for that time period. One is McHale's Navy, The Patty Duke Show, and Petticoat Junction. Those are three shows I, to this day, really have never really watched. I've seen a little bit of McHale's Navy, but it never really grabbed me. Okay, let's move on to the Mystery Spy TV show. Now, I watched a lot fewer of these. The one that I watched the most would have been The Fugitive. My dad was a big fan of The Fugitive, so that when that came on in reruns, he kind of explained to me how good the show was and how everybody was coming home to watch it, because the climax at the end of the series was catching the bad guy. So I thought that was really interesting, and that was an early Quinn Martin successful show. He went on to shows that I produced that I watched a lot more in the 70s. The other three shows here that I watched, I Spy, It Takes a Thief, and The Saint, those I watched much later. And I liked all of those, but I was more college age when I found those on cable TV. And I was most interested in I Spy to see Bill Cosby, to see how he played, basically opposite character. Was not a humorous role at all, a serious role. So I've got four others on here, Mystery Spy category, and that's The Avengers, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., The Green Hornets, and Rat Patrol. All four of those I've never really watched. And I'd like to see a couple of those for sure. The Avengers I keep hearing good things about. And, there just weren't enough hours in the day, and some of these stuff just wasn't available to me in my formative years. So let's move to crime and detective shows. Well, the one I watched the most was the one on reruns the most early in my life, and that's Perry Mason. Now, Raymond Burr was just one of those guys I think parents liked. He seemed a little older than he probably actually was. And it just was a well-made show. I think that started maybe late 50s, but went in well into the 60s. Dragnet was another show I liked. And that was just one of those shows that today is it's just so funny to watch. It's almost a parody of itself. But it was fun then. And the music, you always knew what kind of show it was when you listened to the music. Okay, we also have Mannix, which was a show that went into the early 70s as well. And I remember it more then, but I guess I remember that watching some of the early episodes of Mannix more recently. The Untouchables, a very violent show. That was a great show that I saw in reruns. And these next two are two that I never really saw that I'm aware of, and that's Honey West and Route 66. They look interesting, and you know, some of the stuff you could probably stream now and you can buy on DVD and whatnot, and I just haven't gotten around to it yet. Okay, the Western. Now, my dad once counted how many Westerns were on TV at a given time. This would have been late 50s when he was his later teenage years, and it was an unbelievable amount of Westerns that were on television. And I only know of a couple of them. Now, my earliest memory of television in my life is watching the intro of Bonanza where that parchment paper gets burned by the fire. That is my earliest memory of television. So in that song, I remember watching Bonanza. I remember watching Gunsmoke. My dad was a big Westerns fan. Maverick was one I watched, but a little bit later. I saw that in reruns. So when I watched Bonanza and Gunsmoke, those were still primetime shows that would have been watching maybe the very late 60s into the early 70s. And the next one I'm going to throw in here is the Wild Wild West, which is kind of, do we really call that a Western? Is it, you know, the old West meets James Bond? But that was a fun one to watch. You know, you had all these crazy characters, and it was very Bond-like. Robert Conrad and the Master of Disguises, Artemis Gordon, played by, I'm forgetting his name, Ross Martin. There you go, Ross Martin. The other one I remember was The Rifleman, Chuck Connors, that intro with the, you know, cocking that gun 11 times or whatever it was. We used to emulate that all the time. I thought that was the coolest thing. I don't remember the show much, but I remember the intro. So the other two that are on here that I threw on that I'm aware of but never really watched, that's Rawhide with Eric Fleming and Clint Eastwood, and The Big Valley, which had Barbara Stanwyck in it and also a young Lee Majors. Okay, moving on to sci-fi. I had never liked sci-fi. There was something about it that was always a little disturbing to me, so I stayed away from sci-fi. But it was impossible to stay away from it completely because you may be by a friend's house. My friends love Star Trek. Star Trek was a big show in reruns, and it was just one of those shows that was so different, and it was mysterious and goofy and all those things all wrapped into one, colorful. So I watched some of those here and there, and I remember the outfits more than anything. So that was one in play. The one I did not like was Lost in Space. And a lot of my friends watch Lost in Space as well, but that's one I could not get into. The next one would be The Outer Limits. Now, The Outer Limits, when I watched it, was like a early Saturday afternoon show, and it maybe was on before like the afternoon movie or something. But I always found a couple episodes that I would watch, I remember being scared of that show, more so than The Twilight Zone. And I liked the Twilight Zone more because it was there was a half-hour show. It just was a tighter show. Outer Limits just scared me a little more, but it was good. So out of the sci-fi stuff, those are the two I really watched, Outer Limits and The Twilight Zone. Meanwhile, shows like Time Tunnel and My Favorite Martian, I guess My Favorite Martian would be more of a sitcom, but those kind of got by me. I mean, I hear a lot about Time Tunnel now, and I'm a Lee Merriweather fan, so that's one I may have to watch at some point. Okay, I skipped over one here, and that's variety shows. I don't know too much about variety shows because those weren't really shown in reruns. Obviously, Ed Sullivan was on until the early 70s, but I don't ever really remember watching that much. The Dean Martin show I do remember. Laugh-In I certainly remember. I remember them coming out those little doors in the front. It just was a very fast-moving, humorous, and colorful show. So Laugh-In is one I remember. The Smothers Brothers, I vaguely remember, but not too much. I remember them more for being talked about in the 60s and how they were being canceled and they were too risque and that kind of thing. But they were on the radar. I'm sure there were many other variety shows. They were so huge at the time, I just didn't really watch them. Okay, getting toward the end of the list here, so cartoons. A lot of the cartoons I watched, there was quite a lot of 60s cartoons that were being rerun in the 70s. The main ones for me were the Flintstones and the Jetsons. In fact, I had no idea that those were primetime shows. I just assumed those were like Saturday morning cartoons. But you could tell that they were written more for an adult audience. And as a kid, I really liked them. And I didn't really watch them as an adult, but I always appreciated the writing and the animation, and I was a much bigger fan of the Flintstones over the Jetsons. Remember that sci-fi thing? For some reason, I just wasn't into it too much, so that's why I preferred the Flintstones. But the first cartoon I really remember watching was Rocky and Bullwinkle, and then Mr. Peabody and Sherman stuff, and that was probably the very late 60s and 70s. I don't even know how long it went on, but I do remember those characters, and that was something I watched fairly regularly. And then the last couple here, Johnny Quest is one that I knew about but never really watched. And then the Thunderbirds is a show that not technically a cartoon, I guess, but Thunderbirds, where a guy that I knew, I worked with, I traded him, I made some copies of the $6 Million Man episodes with Bigfoot. And he was so appreciative of that, he made me some copies of the Thunderbirds. And my kids were young enough at the time, and we used to watch the Thunderbirds and get a kind of a kick out of it, but my kids were young enough where they really kind of got into it. So that was always fun to watch some of this stuff with your kids. I did that a lot with my 70s TV. This last category are shows that premiered in the very late 60s and really were more on in the 70s. And shows that I grew up watching. Hawaii Five-0, for example, started in fall of 68. That went till 1980. I remember my parents watching that show, and who could forget the theme song? Scooby-Doo is a cartoon that started in late 69, fall of 69. I mean, that was a Saturday morning staple for us kids in the 70s, and a really well done show. Adam 12, police show, I think that was in 68. But that went quite far into the 70s, and that was just a show that was on that a buddy of mine had a lunchbox of Adam 12, So we watched Adam 12. Okay, the Mod Squad. So that started in 68. That really is more connected with the 60s, even though it went to 73. I remember that show. I remember Link. I remember that afro. He had that huge afro. He wore the shades. He was totally cool. And so I remember that show and didn't watch it much, but I always... since I watched it in the early 70s more so, I kind of associated it with the 70s. Two other shows that started in fall of 69, Room 222 and The Brady Bunch. Yes, they started in 69, but those went to like 75, 74, I think, 1974. So those I associate more with the early 70s. Ditto, The Carol Burnett Show. That was a show that was on in our house a lot. I think that went till about 1978. But that was a show my family watched on Saturday nights. Sesame Street. I'm of the Sesame Street generation, so that show came on when I was about a year or two old, and I grew up watching that through the 70s quite a bit, but it started in 69. And another Raymond Burr show, Ironside. Also a late 60s show that I watched a lot in the 70s with my dad. And I always thought that the intro of that show with the silhouette of him getting shot and falling down and in the wheelchair, that was always rather disturbing to me. I was like, it really caught my attention. And that Quincy Jones music was really, that siren, I thought it was really, really catching. And so that's why I remember that show. And my dad probably let me watch it with him occasionally. And finally, a show that was only on one season, which has got a very good cult following that I saw many years later in the cable television era, is Then Came Bronson, starring Michael Parks. So that was one of those shows. He's on the motorcycle going across the country, finding new adventures and things like that. And that's a show that is, I don't think it's ever been out on DVD yet anyway. A couple of these shows like Batman, I liked it so much that I invested in a bootleg copy of the entire series when my kids were little. So they were like, 3 and 5 or something. So for a couple years, we watched that show, we pull it out and put it on, and they just loved it. So it was totally worth spending, I think it was like $48 to buy the whole series on a bootleg set of DVDs. So that was a lot of fun. A lot of this stuff now, you still can't get on DVD, never was released, or some has been on reruns on cable, but some of these you can find collectors with them, and sometimes you have to buy these on bootlegs, but a lot of this stuff has been released. So that is my list of 60s television shows that I love and that I'm aware of and that I watched and didn't watch. And what I have for you, I've got a little something special for you. I've got a short survey that's on 60s television that I'm just kind of curious about. And the first question, I'm just going to give that away, and that is Ginger or Mary Ann? So you get a chance to vote on things like that on my survey, and I'll put a link at the bottom here underneath the description, and we'll see what you guys all think. I'm a Ginger guy myself, although I wouldn't kick Mary Ann out for eating crackers in bed, but I'm going to go with Ginger. But check out the survey. I'll do a video that has the results shortly after. So I thank you for watching, and I'm going to get back to enjoying the beautiful weather up here in northern Wisconsin.